At just 10 years old, Isabella Moreau believed her grandmother, Margaret, was untouchable until the day she was declared mentally unfit and locked away by her own children. With the family fortune now in greedy hands, Isabella notices one last message from Margaret. The truth lies where time stopped. Following the cryptic clue, she stumbles upon a shocking secret, proving everything was a lie. But the moment she tries to reveal the truth, danger closes in. Will Isabella outsmart the ruthless heirs? Want to know what happened? Watch until the end and don't miss this gripping tale full of twists and emotions. The wind whispered through the grand gardens of the Moreau estate, carrying the sweet scent of roses that Margaret had lovingly tended for decades. The sun bathed the vast lawn in golden light as a young girl, no older than 10, ran barefoot across the grass, her laughter echoing through the air. "Grandma, tell me another story," Isabella begged, climbing onto Margaret's lap, her small hands clutching the soft fabric of her grandmother's shawl. Margaret chuckled, her blue eyes filled with warmth. "Oh, my dear Isabella, I've told you so many stories. Haven't you heard them all by now?" The little girl shook her head vigorously. "No, I want to hear one of your favorites." Margaret sighed playfully, brushing a stray curl from Isabella's face. "All right, but this one is special. It's about a treasure hidden in plain sight." Isabella's eyes widened. "A real treasure?" Margaret nodded, her gaze drifting toward the horizon. "The greatest treasure of all. But only the right person can find it." Isabella leaned in, completely mesmerized. But before Margaret could continue, the sound of footsteps interrupted them. The heavy, deliberate steps of men who did not belong in a place of warmth and laughter. Isabella turned to see her father, Charles, standing at the entrance of the veranda. His face was stiff, his lips pressed into a thin line. Behind him stood her uncles, Robert and Edward, their expressions unreadable. "Mother," Charles said, his voice cold, "it's time." Margaret didn't flinch. Instead, she gave Isabella's hand a gentle squeeze, as if to reassure her. Then, ever so calmly, she stood. "Time for what?" Isabella asked, her small fingers gripping Margaret's tighter. Her father hesitated before crouching to her level, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sweetheart, your grandmother is unwell. She needs to rest somewhere safe." Isabella's heart pounded. That didn't sound right. Margaret wasn't sick. She was strong. She was the wisest person Isabella knew. "No," Isabella whispered. "She's fine. She's—" But before she could protest, Robert and Edward stepped forward. One of them took Margaret's arm. The other placed a firm hand on Isabella's shoulder. Margaret knelt in front of her granddaughter, her voice barely above a whisper. "Listen to me, my love. The truth is, where time has stopped." Isabella frowned, confusion and fear swirling inside her. "What do you mean?" But before she could ask anything else, her uncles pulled Margaret away. The last thing Isabella saw was her grandmother being led into a waiting car, her silhouette disappearing behind tinted windows. And then, silence. Isabella stood frozen, her father's hand resting on her back, guiding her inside. She wanted to scream, to run after Margaret, to stop whatever was happening, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. The Moreau estate was quieter than ever, not the peaceful, comforting quiet Isabella had known when her grandmother sat reading by the window or when they shared whispered secrets by the fireplace. No, this silence was different, heavy, suffocating. Since Margaret had been taken away, the house had become colder. The once lively rooms now felt empty, even though the halls were filled with people. Lawyers came and went. Men in suits sat in the grand study, speaking in hushed voices. Isabella's father and uncles were always busy, locked behind closed doors, reviewing documents she wasn't allowed to see, and no one mentioned Margaret. At first, Isabella tried asking, "When can I see Grandma?" she had asked at breakfast. Her father barely looked up from his newspaper. "She's not well, Isabella." "But where is she?" "That's not for you to worry about," Charles said flatly, taking a sip of his coffee. Robert and Edward exchanged glances. Isabella noticed the way their shoulders stiffened, the way they avoided her eyes. The same answer. Over and over, that night, as Isabella lay in bed, she clenched her fists under the covers. Something was wrong. She felt it, the way the adults acted, the way no one would look her in the eye when she brought up Margaret. She rolled over, staring at the moonlight filtering through her window. Her grandmother's words echoed in her mind. "The truth is where time has stopped." What did that mean? Isabella sat up. She couldn't just lie there. She needed answers. She tiptoed down the dimly lit hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. The house felt different at night, the shadows stretching across the walls like long, creeping fingers. She hesitated in front of her grandmother's bedroom door. It was always left open during the day, but now it was shut. Her fingers trembled as she turned the knob. The room was spotless, too spotless. It didn't smell like lavender anymore. The shelves were dusted, the books neatly arranged, and the rocking chair where Margaret had always sat was gone. Someone had erased her. A lump formed in Isabella's throat. She stepped carefully toward the vanity, her fingertips trailing over the polished wood, and then something caught her eye, a small silver object lying on the nightstand, her grandmother's old pocket watch. Isabella picked it up, feeling the cold metal against her palm. The watch had always been with Margaret. She never went anywhere without it, but now it was here, left behind, and when Isabella turned it over, she realized something strange. The hands were stuck. The time had stopped at 11:43. Her pulse quickened. Margaret's words whispered in her mind once more. "The truth is where time has stopped." Isabella gripped the watch tightly, her breath shallow. She didn't know what it meant yet, but she was going to find out. The next morning, Isabella noticed something different. The air in the house felt heavier, like a storm was brewing just beneath the surface. Her father and uncles were always talking in hushed voices, slipping into rooms and shutting the doors behind them. Isabella wasn't supposed to notice. They barely paid attention to her. She was just a child, too young to understand, too small to be a threat, but she was watching. At breakfast, her father seemed more distracted than usual, stirring his coffee but never drinking it. Her uncles sat across from him, whispering under their breath. Isabella couldn't hear much, but she caught fragments. "Will be finalized soon. She won't be a problem. Once it's settled, we can—" A throat cleared. The three men stopped speaking at once. Isabella glanced up to see Uncle Robert staring at her. His gaze was sharp, calculating. "What are you looking at, Isabella?" he asked, his voice light, almost amused. Isabella froze. "Nothing," she mumbled, quickly lowering her eyes to her plate. "Good." He gave her a thin smile before turning back to his conversation. Something was wrong. After breakfast, she wandered the house, lingering near the study, listening. The door was cracked open just enough for her to hear the tension in their voices. "That old woman was too stubborn," Uncle Edward was saying. "She refused to sign over control, but now things are different." Charles sighed. "I didn't want it to come to this, but she left us no choice. The court believed us. No one's going to question a judge's ruling." Isabella pressed herself against the wall, her heart hammering. They were talking about Margaret. They had planned this. "Are you sure everything is handled?" Robert asked. "No surprises." Pause. Charles exhaled. "She was the only one who could stop us. And now she's locked away. The estate is ours." Ours. The word made Isabella's skin prickle. They had taken everything from Margaret. They had wanted her out of the way. But why? Isabella took a shaky step back, her mind racing. Her father, her own father, had betrayed Margaret. She wanted to run, to scream at them, to demand answers, but something stopped her, her grandmother's words. The truth is, where time has stopped, the pocket watch. A sick feeling settled in her stomach. Whatever her grandmother had been trying to tell her, it wasn't over yet. She had to find out the truth, before it was too late. Isabella knew she had to be careful. The more she listened, the more she realized just how deep her family's betrayal went. Her father and uncles had worked together to remove Margaret, stealing what wasn't theirs. And now they sat comfortably in the mansion, as if she had never existed, but Isabella wouldn't let them erase her grandmother. She started paying closer attention, watching, listening. The men were always busy in the study, poring over documents, making calls. Occasionally, men in suits arrived, carrying briefcases and shaking hands. Isabella didn't understand everything they said, but one word kept coming up: inheritance. She had heard it before, in stories about kings and queens. It had something to do with wealth. But why were they talking about it now? Margaret was still alive, unless... They were planning to keep things this way. A chill ran through her. That night, when the house had quieted, Isabella crept into the sitting room, where her grandmother always spent time reading. Maybe Margaret had left something behind, something the men had missed. She ran her fingers over the bookshelf, feeling for anything out of place. Nothing. She checked under cushions, inside drawers, still nothing. But then, as she knelt by the fireplace, her fingers brushed against something smooth beneath the rug. She lifted the fabric, revealing a loose floorboard. Her breath caught. Just as she reached for it, a voice cut through the darkness. "What do you think you're doing?" Isabella whirled around. Uncle Edward stood in the doorway, his arms crossed. The dim light made his sharp features look even colder. I was just looking for my book," she stammered. Edward stepped closer. "At this hour?" His eyes flicked to the floor. "Seems like you were looking for something else." Isabella swallowed hard. For the first time she realized. She wasn't just eavesdropping anymore. She was a threat, and her family had already proven what they were willing to do to get what they wanted. She had to be smarter. Margaret's words echoed in her mind. The truth is, where time has stopped. If she wanted to save her grandmother, she needed to figure out what that meant, before it was too late. Isabella barely slept that night. Uncle Edward's piercing gaze haunted her, his suspicion lingering. Like a shadow. She knew now, if she made one wrong move, they would stop her. And if they had done this to Margaret, what would they do to a child who knew too much? But she couldn't stop. The next morning, she acted normal. She ate breakfast. Quietly, avoided eye contact and stayed out of the adults' way. But her mind was racing. She needed to get back to that loose floorboard. By afternoon, most of the household was busy. Her father and uncles locked in another meeting, the servants occupied. This was her chance. Heart pounding, she slipped into the sitting room, her small hands trembling as she lifted the rug again. The loose board creaked softly as she pried it open. Inside, there was something wrapped in an old silk handkerchief. She pulled it out and carefully unwrapped it. Her breath hitched. A tiny golden key. It was delicate, old, and slightly tarnished, but unmistakably important. Isabella's fingers tightened around it. Margaret had hidden this. But why? She turned it over in her palm, searching for any markings. And then she remembered. The pocket watch. She had already opened it. But what if she had missed something? Maybe the key unlocked a second compartment. Her heart pounded as she fished the watch out of her pocket. Hands shaking, she examined the back carefully, and then she felt it. A nearly invisible groove along the rim. She slid the key into the tiny slot. Click, the back of the watch popped open. Inside, tucked carefully beneath the metal casing, was a folded piece of paper. Isabella swallowed hard as she unfolded it. But before she could read the words, a voice came from the doorway. "I told you she was up to something." Isabella spun around. Uncle Robert stood there, and this time He wasn't smiling. Isabella's fingers clenched around the paper as Uncle Robert stepped into the room. His polished shoes clicked against the floor, each step deliberate, slow. "I knew you were snooping," he said, shutting the door behind him. "Just like your grandmother, always sticking your nose where it doesn't belong." Isabella's heart pounded. She fought the urge to run. She knew he would catch her. Instead, she slipped the paper into the pocket of her dress, forcing herself to stand tall. "I was just looking for Grandma's things," she said, keeping her voice steady. "I miss her." Robert tilted his head, studying her. Then, to her surprise, he laughed. "Oh, Isabella," he sighed. "You're a smart little girl, aren't you?" He crouched to her level, his eyes dark and amused. "But you need to understand something. This house, this fortune, it doesn't belong to Margaret anymore." Isabella swallowed hard. "But she's still alive." Robert's jaw tightened just for a moment. Then he smiled again. "She's not coming back." A cold chill ran through her. "What did you do to her?" she whispered. Robert tisked, wagging a finger. "That's not your concern. What is your concern is what happens next." His voice lowered. "I know you found something. Hand it over, and I won't tell your father you've been sneaking around." Isabella's fingers curled into a fist. "I don't have anything." His smile faded. "Lying isn't very becoming of you, Isabella." He reached toward her pocket. She reacted. Without thinking, she darted backward, slipping around the chair, knocking over a lamp in the process. The noise was deafening in the quiet room. Robert lunged for her, but she was already running, out the door, down the hall, her heart pounding in her ears. She didn't stop until she reached the servants' wing, where the halls were darker, quieter. She pressed herself against the wall, trying to catch her breath. She needed help, and there was only one person left in this house she could trust, the old butler, Mr. Lawson. Taking a deep breath, Isabella turned and made her way toward his quarters, because if she was going to save her grandmother, she couldn't do it alone. Isabella knocked softly on the old wooden door, her hands still trembling. For years, Mr. Lawson had been more than just a butler. He had been Margaret's most trusted friend. If anyone in this house still cared about the truth, it was him. The door creaked open, revealing the elderly man's lined face. His sharp grey eyes softened when he saw her. "Miss Isabella," he murmured. "What are you doing here?" She hesitated. "I need your help." Lawson studied her for a moment before stepping aside. "Come in, quickly." She slipped inside, and he shut the door behind her. The room was simple, neat, filled with old books and faint traces of pipe smoke. "I found something," she whispered, pulling out the delicate paper she had hidden in her pocket. "Something Grandma left for me." Lawson took the note, unfolding it carefully. As he read, his face paled, his fingers tightened around the edges. "She knew," he murmured. "She knew they would do this." Isabella leaned forward. "What does it say?" Lawson looked at her, his voice grave. "It's a copy of her will, a real one, not the one they showed the court." He turned the paper so she could see. There, in Margaret's delicate handwriting, were the words that changed everything. "I leave my estate and all its holdings to my granddaughter, Isabella Moreau." The breath caught in Isabella's throat. "It's all yours," Lawson said softly, "and they lied to take it from you." A mix of fear and anger boiled inside her. "We have to show someone, a lawyer, a judge, someone who can stop them." Lawson hesitated. "They won't let you leave the house easily. They know you're onto them." A sudden crash echoed from the hall. Isabella froze. "They're coming," Lawson whispered. He grabbed her hand and pulled open a small door in the corner of the room. A hidden passage. "Go, Miss Isabella. Follow this tunnel. It leads to the greenhouse. From there you can get outside." She shook her head. "What about you?" "I'll buy you time," he said, his eyes firm. "Now run." Tears burned in her eyes, but she turned and bolted down the passage. She had the truth in her hands. Now she just had to survive long enough to prove it. Isabella clutched the fragile paper as she ran, her legs burning with exhaustion. The cold night air whipped against her face, but she didn't stop. Behind her she could hear voices. Her father and uncles had realized she was gone. The gates of the Moreau estate loomed ahead, and just beyond them, headlights. A black car screeched to a stop. The door flew open, and a man in a dark suit stepped out. "Isabella," he called. His voice was strong, urgent. "Margaret Moreau sent me. Do you have it?" She barely had time to nod before strong hands grabbed her from behind. "Enough of this," her father growled, yanking her back. Uncle Robert loomed over her, his eyes dark with fury. "Give me the paper." The lawyer, Margaret's lawyer, stepped forward. "I suggest you let go of the child, Charles, unless you want to add assaulting a minor to your crimes." Her father hesitated, then released Isabella with a shove. "She doesn't understand what she has." "Oh, I do." Isabella shot back, holding the paper tightly. "It's Grandma's real will, and I'm taking it to court." The next morning, the courtroom was filled with tension. Reporters whispered in the back. Lawyers murmured among themselves. And at the defense table, Charles, Robert, and Edward Moreau sat stiffly, their polished appearances betraying none of their panic. Then the doors opened. Margaret Moreau entered, flanked by doctors who had confirmed what Isabella already knew. She was perfectly sane. Gasps filled the room. Isabella sat beside her, her tiny hand gripping her grandmother's. "We're going to win, Grandma," Margaret squeezed back. "We already have, my love." The judge entered and the trial began. Isabella's lawyer stepped forward, presenting the will. "This document, Your Honor, was hidden because it reveals the truth. Margaret Moreau's rightful heir is her granddaughter, not her son's." Charles's lawyer jumped up. "This is absurd. The court already ruled on this matter." "The court ruled based on a forged will," the judge interrupted coldly. Silence. The lawyer cleared his throat. "This child, she's 10 years old. How can we trust her word?" Margaret, despite her frailty, lifted her head proudly. "Because I trust her more than I ever trusted my own sons." The judge examined the will, then turned to Charles and his brothers. "Do you deny that this is your mother's true handwriting?" They exchanged glances. Beads of sweat formed on Charles's brow. "We—" His voice faltered before he could finish. The doors to the courtroom swung open. Mr. Lawson, the loyal butler, stepped inside, and he wasn't alone. 2 private investigators followed, holding folders thick with documents. One of them, a sharp-eyed woman, stepped forward. "Your Honor, we have evidence that Charles Moreau and his brothers falsified legal documents, bribed officials, and deliberately committed fraud against their own mother." The courtroom erupted. Charles shot to his feet. "That's a lie." "Is it?" the investigator asked, pulling out records, bank transactions, secret meetings, signed confessions from former employees. "Proof." Robert paled. Edward looked like he might faint. The judge slammed his gavel. "Enough. The evidence is overwhelming." He turned to Margaret, then to Isabella. "Mrs. Moreau, your estate is restored, and as for you 3... He glared at Charles and his brothers. A pause. Then, "Bailiff, take them into custody." Gasps filled the room. Reporters scrambled to take notes. Isabella watched as her father and uncles were led away, their futures crumbling. Justice had been served. Outside the courtroom, Margaret turned to Isabella. "You saved me," she whispered. Isabella shook her head. "You saved yourself, Grandma. You just left me the clues." Margaret smiled, pulling her into a tight embrace. "One day, you'll understand how much courage it takes to fight for the truth." The cameras flashed. The world was watching, but Isabella didn't care. She had her grandmother back. And for the first time in weeks, she felt safe. The Moreau estate was hers now, but more importantly, justice was hers. And as they walked away from the courthouse together, Isabella knew one thing for sure. Her grandmother had always been right. A wolf will always show its true nature when it smells the feast. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more incredible tales. And remember, sometimes the truth hides in the places we least expect.